We all know the glory that was Rome and the Renaissance that launched our modern world. But what about the centuries that lay between? Once considered stagnant and scorned by historians of times past, this period has been called the Dark Ages. But was it so dark and stagnant? We're about to find out as we take a penetrating look at this strange and wonderful period we now call the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a study in contradictions. Majestic architecture in the face of widespread illiteracy. Savage wars waged in the name of religious principles. Unbelievable hardships survived by astonishing resilience. To help us tell the story of the Middle Ages, we have three subject matter experts. Claudia Rapp of UCLA.
My own education started in a German high school where Latin was my first foreign language, and I then learned Greek. As I went to university to study ancient Greek and history, I became fascinated in the survival and the actual continuity of Greek literature.
Paul Friedman of Yale University.
One of the big differences between the Middle Ages and Greece and Rome is the nature of the army. Just from a tactical point of view, the military, the Middle Ages was based on an army of horsemen.
Teofilo Ruiz of UCLA.
I think that I was attracted to the Middle Ages as we all attracted to certain disciplines or to certain fields for the wrong reasons. That is to say, I had very charismatic teachers who taught the Middle Ages.
No longer considered dark and stagnant, the Middle Ages are now seen to be the vital groundwork on which our modern world is built.
The Dark Ages was a term that people in the Renaissance, 15th, 16th century, used to distance themselves, to criticize the era that they thought they had liberated themselves from. They thought they had rediscovered classical culture, and that between them and the classical Greek and Roman world that they so admired was a period of barbarism and darkness. It's not a period of complete barbarism or of stagnation or of misery. It's a period that is distinct in its civilization and has, like other periods of civilization, grand as well as miserable episodes.
Basically, we try to avoid using the term Dark Ages because A, we don't want to pass negative judgment on the past, and B, because to us they don't seem so dark anymore in the light of recent scholarship. There has been a great deal of research that has been done which allows us to throw more light on the Dark Ages. That gives us a more refined view of this period, for which there are very few written sources, but at the same time, in view of archaeological research in the last couple of decades, we now know a great deal more about how people lived. And so the Dark Ages don't appear as dark as they used to be.
I think I want to elaborate a bit on this, because the Dark Ages is really in relation to the perceived glory of the antique world, of the classical world, specifically of Rome. And if you travel through Europe, you could still see this. You will see the ruins, the remnants of a great civilization. And for them, this was a world of such incredible development, of such incredible achievements, that their own times paled. There was a sense of decline, of something having become darkened, something being lost.
I guess the two things I would say about the Middle Ages that strike me are, one, that it's incredibly dynamic. And this gets at the question of the Dark Ages or of stagnation or of an image that we have that, while it's an exciting period because people are hacking each other to bits and it has a lot of Gothic splendor and weird-looking outfits and sinister figures, witches, dungeons, torture, and stuff like that, that in fact it is a period in which the European domination of the world, for better or worse, which was a phenomenon of the last 500 years, was established, and in which so much of what we are familiar with, from states to parliaments to universities, came into being.
The Middle Ages spans roughly 1,000 years, from late in the 5th century to about the middle of the 15th century. In order to organize their study of this vast period, historians have recognized 3 sub-periods: the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the later Middle Ages. Starting in the 5th century, the early Middle Ages is considered to have extended roughly to the year 1000. The High Middle Ages continued from there till about 1300, and the later Middle Ages extends to the mid-15th century. In the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire, the early Middle Ages were a time of both societal decay and religious growth. It was a period ruled by people the conquered Romans would call barbaric.
Well, our use of the word barbaric goes back to the original term that was first coined by the ancient Greeks, who referred to barbaroi, who referred with the term barbaroi to anybody whose language they didn't understand. So it's basically what we now, the equivalent of what we now use as mumbo jumbo, you know, some kind of language of which you can't make sense. And in that sense, then, this word was taken over and applied to foreign tribes. And so, because these foreign tribes, as they infiltrated the Roman Empire, were obviously threatening internal stability, they were threatening society, Rome, the city of Rome, was sacked several times by these Germanic tribes, we now associate them with these particular deeds, which now seem as barbaric, and hence the term gets applied in the common sense that we now use it for, as being sort of atrocious and savage.
Eventually, a sense of order was restored in Europe following the barbarian invasions, and the ideals of ancient Rome survived. Modern historians give the Christian Church the credit.
It is certainly paradoxical that the church, which the Roman Empire had persecuted, became not only the entity that survived the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, but also the one that most preserved Roman ideals, from the Latin language, which was the language of the Catholic Church until very recently, the style of dress that priests wore was that of antiquity. The very fact of Rome itself being the center of the Catholic world reflected, obviously, a tremendous loyalty to Rome.
When Christianity conquers the empire, Christianity had itself molded its structures, its organizational structure and all that, along the lines of the Roman imperial administration. So you could say that Rome did not fall, but that Christendom inherited Rome. And therefore the church wielded a great deal of power. The church remained in the West the only corporate body. That is to say, it is the only one that had a sense of its continuity, and that it operated in what, and I put this within quotation marks, in a public way. That is to say, the church it was a corporation, as opposed to the private character of kingship in this period.
Once Christianity was recognized as a legitimate religion under Constantine, and as it became state religion in the course of the 4th century, Christians began to come to some kind of positive compromise and evaluation of the Roman Empire.
As converts to Christianity grew in number, the structure of the church was in the process of finding itself. The concept of a pope developed only gradually. In the early years of the church, there was no strong central leadership.
The rise of the papacy is a very slow process that really only begins with the 5th, 6th century and then gradually takes off. And of course, by the time of the investiture conflict in the 11th century, we have the full-fledged papacy that makes claims to influencing the secular sphere as well. But originally, the Pope of Rome was nothing but a bishop, like all other bishops in the empire. And according to some estimates, there were about 2,000 bishops throughout the empire at around the year 500.
A key figure in the reorganization of Europe was a man known by one name, Charlemagne.
The coronation of Charlemagne is a much debated moment in history. I remember in my German history book, the chapter on antiquity ended with, on Christmas Day of the year 800, Charlemagne was proclaimed emperor, and the next sentence was, the Middle Ages began. It was a wonderful, neat division that sort of stuck in my mind forever. It's not quite that easy.
When we talk about Charlemagne, we're talking about a couple of different things. One is certainly a man who, for a brief time, seemed to have revived the Roman Empire for real after over 300 years of its being just really a memory.
He is, in some respects, the first one who conceives of the idea of a united Europe under a kind of one single leader. And in many respects, what has been taking place in Europe in the last 15, 20 years, the emergence of a united Europe, is in some ways a kind of return to the world of Charlemagne.
He had himself proclaimed Roman emperor on Christmas Day in 800 by the Pope, and he was able to make good on this claim in that he ruled over much of what has now become Western Europe. Charlemagne had his capital in what's now Germany, although he made it to be modeled on Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Still, the fact that it was in Germany shows you that this was, in some sense, not really very Roman.
While Charlemagne is known for his military and political leadership, he also brought a renewed sense of culture to medieval Europe. This despite the fact that the majority of the population, including Charlemagne himself, was illiterate.
Because of his wars, which bring him a great deal of booty, specifically the treasure of the Avars, Charlemagne is able to create in his court, and his children and grandchildren will follow on these steps, a cultural center which leads to a minor renaissance, which plays a very significant role in European history. You could say that without the achievements of Charlemagne, which are not necessarily all warlike, there would not be a Europe today as we know it. And our civilization and culture, that which we call Western civilization, will be quite different altogether.
Following the death of Charlemagne in 814, the empire he had formed, too large to be ruled effectively by anyone less talented, went into decline yet again. What once had been considered a single empire broke up into small regions whose rulers wielded more power than their emperors. At the same time, the frontiers of Western Europe were again being invaded, this time by the Norsemen from the north, the Muslims from the south, and the Magyars from the east. The High Middle Ages saw the introduction of the armored knight on horseback, cavalries of mounted soldiers, and castles defended by bow and arrow. This was the era of the religious crusades and Gothic cathedrals. But all of these things grew out of a contradictory mix of interests whose common denominator was war.
Middle Ages is a society organized for war. And when we talk about feudalism, for example, we're really talking about a society that gears its economy to support at least one elite class of military rulers, that is to say, the other class being spiritual rulers or the clergy. In any kind of society like that, obviously, a huge amount of wealth is going into things like castles, armor, weapons, recruiting and paying of troops, and it exacts a price on the countryside of plunder and the kind of disorder we associate with war.
This is, of course, this is the favorite topic of high school students and so on, and it's a very important one because there is a very clear relationship between warfare and social organization. Now, we know that there is no heavy cavalry in Western Europe until the 8th century. That is to say, there are people who go to war on horseback, and there are people who fight on horseback, but there is no heavy cavalry. You could not fight on horseback in Europe, and it's not until the beginning of the 8th century, with the introduction of the stirrup, that you can, in a sense, change warfare. Covered with some kind of protection, in which man and horse become a fighting unit, transform the social organization of the medieval West. Why? Because fighting on horseback is a very specialized activity. You have to learn it very early in your life. You cannot really learn to be a good horseman if you don't begin to ride a horse very early in your life.
But to be such a knight required incredible amounts of training. It's very difficult to fight with 60 pounds of armor on you and to maneuver a horse in a battle. And that meant that unlike in Greece and Rome, where you could have a foot soldier who was a fully militarily competent person, the only people who could really be militarily competent in the Middle Ages were an elite. An elite defined by wealth, because a horse was more expensive than a house. An elite defined by training, because unless you started as a boy, you never were going to make much of a knight. And this meant that instead of the very large infantry armies of Greece and Rome, you had much smaller.
Therefore, medieval warfare is really a rather, should we say, violent, but not necessarily fatal affair. You fall down from your horse, you break a leg, you surrender, you are ransomed, you are captured, you go away. You don't really want to fight to the end.
As the knights became clearly the dominant element of society, they gained in prestige. So that if you look at something like the 11th century, knights are little more than thugs, hired gangsters, the kinds of people who surround a leader, much as an organized crime figure might have various people who go out and kill people for him. The knights then are little more than gang members. But as is true of gangs as well, they have certain codes of honors, certain kinds of rituals, certain kinds of ways of feeling themselves to be powerful and set up over other people by their courage, by their bravery. It also has to do with just ceremony and the medieval love of pageantry, symbolism, colors, processions, so that beginning with the late 12th and certainly expanding in the 13th and 14th century, knighthood becomes what we think of it from our impressions of dubbing, ceremonial kinds of armor, coats of arms, different pennants, elaborate armor, ostrich plume, feathers, and things like that. Knighthood then becomes a symbol of social status, of domination, of bravery and a masculine ideal of upper-class status.
These symbols become more and more Christian as the Crusades advance the idea of violence mobilized in the direction of Christianity. War and church, two things that, on the surface, could not be farther apart.
The Crusades always seem to me really key to the Middle Ages because they combine the two things that drive the medieval imagination. One, warfare, and two, religion. And if you could combine these two things that at first glance seem to be completely irreconcilable, you have a very powerful emotional and historical force. And that's what the Crusades are, an effort to wage war, but not for supposedly selfish reasons, but for the liberation of the Holy Land from the Muslim infidel. In fact, of course, many crusaders went for plunder or to establish themselves as great men. On the other hand, we know that they went knowing that the likelihood of their coming back was less than 50-50, so that in investment terms it was extremely risky, and they also knew that it would be a tremendous ordeal. So that it's hard to say, or I certainly wouldn't say, that they went for completely cynical reasons. In other words, they had absolutely no interest in the religious content and were simply in on it for the plunder and the status.
In some respects, the Crusades are part of a larger movement of Europeans out of Europe into other parts of the world, which is composed of several elements: exploration in some cases, and also, in many respects, the imposition of Christianity, and in some cases,
renown. And renown, as we said when we were talking about knighthood, is the thing that's most important for them. Honor, fame, glory. And that glory would consist of both the acquisition of a great fortune, of new titles, of castles, of plunder, and of doing God's work. And so, from their point of view, what we see as two contradictory things, namely plunder and ambition on the one hand, and piety and devotion to God on the other, were not contradictory at all, but the same quest.
Driven by religious motives as they were, for these massive campaigns to be realized, they had to have the support of some central animating force within the church. This force was no less than the office of the Pope. But as the violent nature of the Crusades seems to run contrary to the reverend nature of these pontiffs, historians have struggled to explain how they could justify such massive killing.
How did the papacy get the idea of the crusade, and what did the popes think that they were going to get out of the crusade, is a difficult and often debated question among historians. Clearly, the popes thought that they would divert some of the incredible energy that the knights of Europe had displayed towards what they regarded as more productive ends. And in fact, in preaching the crusade, we know that the popes and their agents or legates said, why kill each other in senseless slaughter that will only lead to your damnation when you can put that skill to work killing those who are the enemies of the faith?
it is, yes, a religious phenomenon. And when you read some of the chronicles about the first sight of Jerusalem, people weeping at the sight of Jerusalem, it tells you about the very heightened sense which they had of their own connections to the sacred, to the Holy Land. But it is also an economic affair. It is also a way of sending all those young, restless men out to fight somebody else. It is also a political event, so that there are many crusades, and each of them has a very different characteristic. And all of them are the result of combined elements, not just a single one. They have elements which are religious, but they certainly have elements which are deeply economic, in which greed and violence are very present indeed.
Whatever the motivation for risking one's life in a holy war, it's clear that religion played a far more profound role in the lives of the people of the Middle Ages than it does in our lives today.
I want to say first and foremost that it is very difficult to conceive the Middle Ages outside the context of religion. Meaning by this that everyone in the Middle Ages lived within a religious world.
They believe that the divine permeates the world in ways that we don't. Now, we have revived this. I think that we are as superstitious as they were. And it's interesting that we're as superstitious as they were because we have supposedly all these scientific, naturalistic explanations of phenomena, which they did not have. But I think that they had a greater sense of purpose. But they also have just very weird ideas about the human body, about the relationship of the human body to the cosmos, about fortune, and about how much you can control life, and about the physical world and a human being's place in it.
That religious faith was so much a part of life during the Middle Ages can be seen in their majestic cathedrals. The term used to identify this style of architecture is Gothic.
The style that we call Gothic in the Middle Ages was, maybe not surprisingly, called modern. The modern style of the 15th century was this rather spiky, pointy, vertical aesthetic, later known as Gothic.
You cannot but be impressed by the loftiness of the building, by the sense of how this, we will not even call them architects, craftsmen who build these churches, really try to reach for eternity.
I think that the cathedrals are an expression of religious devotion and of a kind of pride. The pride is not that designed to intimidate the lower orders, but to express the prosperity and the skill of the people who built the cathedrals. Often these are urban people whose wealth contributed to their building. The cathedrals contain often the tombs of the local elite. They're full of the coats of arms, of the symbols of the different guilds that helped build them, the shoemakers, the goldsmiths, the spice merchants, and so forth. They are expressions of technical skill, but they're also expressions of a kind of pride that is both similar and different to, say, the building of a big stadium now, or the building of some huge civic project, an aquarium like the one in Baltimore, or skyscrapers in New York.
And you have to imagine it as it was in the Middle Ages. Buildings with no sitting arrangements, people stood or sat on the floor. Open spaces, no choirs, which are really an addition of the Baroque period of the Counter-Reformation.
These were projects whose completion the people who started them could not hope ever to see. A fast cathedral took 50 years, and many cathedrals took centuries, so that they represent a kind of enterprise that is both glorious and indicates a belief in, if not eternity, but in a very long future.
The cathedrals are even more remarkable when one considers that most of the people who built them were illiterate.
It's not a paradox, in my opinion, that the same people who had only a very small minority able to read and write could build such magnificent structures as cathedrals, or the more scary and practical structures, castles. The master masons who built the cathedrals were not illiterate. They had certain kinds of mathematical skills, but an awful lot of what the Middle Ages is about craft, is about the mastery of materials like stone, or of how do you get stones lifted up so high.
In the 11th and 12th century, you have the emergence of castles. Castles are part of that process which Tom Bisson at Harvard, a great medieval historian, have called the feudal revolution. That is to say, they are used by feudal lords the second rank of the feudal lords, to terrorize the countryside and to exact contributions from peasants and to impose their power on the peasantry and to, in a sense, impose of them a series of demands. It's what is called the bad uses, the bad customs in which you extract a great deal of income from the peasants. Castles cannot be taken in spite of Hollywood, or are very difficult to take because, first of all, you don't have organized armies that can be kept on the fields for a long time. A feudal host will disappear on you after a certain number of days. If you have a lot of water and you have a lot of food, you could wait on these people.
In one sense, it was the unique structure of medieval society that developed during the High Middle Ages that produced both these extraordinary works of Gothic architecture and almost constant warfare. This structure, called feudalism or manorialism, has by now completely disappeared from the face of the earth. But then it was an ideal system. People lived off the land. Farming and hunting were two of the most common activities. For the commoners, hunting was a necessity. For the nobility, it was also a sport.
In talking about the kind of society people had in the Middle Ages, we use words like manorialism or feudalism to mean basically a society that was overwhelmingly rural, in which cities were almost non-existent, or if they existed, very tiny, in which there was very little money.
What we really mean by feudalism is not fully developed until the 8th and 9th century. And there are several ways of defining that which we call feudalism, and which I actually do not like to use the term. You could say that is the relationships between two free men, the lord and a vassal, and it's a private relationship, not a public one, in which one man gives himself to another, though he remains free, and provides military service and other service in return for maintenance. That is to say, he will be giving a piece of land and an income and protection. And that is the lord-vassal relationship. And the relation and the related element is the lord-peasant relationship, which we call sometimes manorialism.
The dynamism that meant that the Middle Ages could grow economically was provided by that very rural and military structure. We know that it provided what I guess I've called dynamism because we know that the population grew tremendously.
Of course, this is very fine for the few people on top who pray and fight, but 95% of the population work endlessly and give as much as half, sometimes even more of their income to support the others who never work.
The vassals and peasants of manorialism and feudalism were called serfs. Because serfs worked in the service of their lords, it's hard in the 21st century to think of serfs as anything but slaves. But manorialism and feudalism provided a unique community in which serfs were actually free men.
Serfdom is, I would say, more than just a Christianized or medieval form of slavery. And the differences are that serfs actually had a piece of land that was theirs. They were settled on that piece of land. They could transmit it to their heirs. Their family could inherit it. And in fact, insofar as they were tied to their master, they were more tied to the land. It was difficult or impossible sometimes for them to leave it. Whereas slaves did not have a particular piece of land, and as we know, could be bought and sold apart from any kind of place where they were located. The other big difference between serfs and slaves is that serfs had families that were recognized as inseparable and as legally binding units. Whereas in slavery, marriage did not have to be recognized by the masters who separated families, selling husband and wife to different buyers. This could not happen with serfs.
If anything belies the idea that the Middle Ages were dark, it's the fact that the activity of learning was revered.
When we're talking about medieval ideas of learning, we are talking, of course, about a society in which a minority are studying, but if anything, that means that studying was more prized.
In the Middle Ages, we're dealing with a society that sees itself and the world in exclusively religious terms, so that all learning is taken as having a religious significance. And so with that kind of broad definition of theology, you can fit, for example, the study of law into it by thinking of it as something that helps you to regulate society and to help Christians interact with each other. You can subsume the study of medicine, which became a very important topic at the same university in Bologna at the same time as Roman law was being revived at the time. You can think of that as dealing with and understanding how the human body works, and the human body, of course, is a creation of God.
The first real medieval university, which is, by the way, a concept quite new and did not exist in antiquity. The first university is the University of Salerno, and it's really a medical school.
The establishment of these universities and the intellectual growth they represented was an important step in the rise of Western Europe. Also, the spread of Christianity and the tripling of the population, along with the development of new political systems, put medieval Europe squarely on the path to the present. But massive and destructive obstacles lay ahead. In the later Middle Ages, the first kings and kingdoms appeared. Instead of castles, the nobles of this era built great palaces. Some of the most admired works of literature were produced, and the concept of nation-states came into being.
By the 13th century, you start to have things that we can call states, national monarchies, or states ruled over by kings with recognizable borders, and places in which the king has, if not supreme power, at least not a lot of competitors from other noblemen or from the church, so that rulers like the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa or the Emperor Frederick II, King Henry II, Edward III of England, King Philip II, Philip IV of France are rulers of this type. By the end of the Middle Ages, this is clearly advanced, and you have the development of what used to be called the new monarchies, which were thought to be really the ancestor of the modern state. Places ruled over by people like Henry IV of France or Ferdinand and Isabella, the King and Queen of Spain.
Despite the relative uniformity of society, many countries had no central ruler or king. Others during this period, however, developed very powerful monarchies.
The question here is, why is the emergence of kingdoms in England and France, and why it doesn't happen in Italy, or I could add, why it doesn't happen in Germany? Feudal relationships and feudal kingship. William the Conqueror established a kind of vassalitic relationships in which all the vassals depend from the king, and therefore begins his processes of centralizing power, which eventually leads to the formation of what we call nations or kingdoms. Italy, however, is a very different place. Italy is, in theory, under the rulership of the Holy Roman Emperor, as it is Germany.
Neither Germany nor Italy was unified under a national monarchy. And it's not clear that they did worse than England and France for the time being. The fact that by the 19th century it looked like the England and French model was the best doesn't mean that for centuries before it was clear that it was.
The emergence of the centralized monarchies presented a conflict of major proportions for the papacy. Whereas in previous bids for power, the church always seemed to prevail, this time the result was different.
I think that the church lost power and influence not because of the failure of the Crusades to permanently occupy the Holy Land for Christianity, although that certainly couldn't have helped them. But I would say the most important factor in the decline of the church's power is simply the rise in the power of the state, the city, and the individual.
With the church in decline and secular leaders firmly in command, Western Europe finally seemed poised on the brink of an economic breakthrough, but nature had other ideas.
The Middle Ages that I study, or the Middle Ages that I work on, is a harsh world. It's a world of oppression. It's a world of famines. It's a world of peasants who die very early. It's a world where children die in untold numbers, where probably 50% of all the children born die within a year or two. It's a world where everybody is hungry all the time and on the edge of doom. You get a cut and you die. You have a toothache and you go crazy. You know, there's no aspirins, there is no antibiotics. There is, in the 14th century, which is a very pretty awful century, the average lifespan is 29. That doesn't mean that people drop dead at 29. It means that the number of people who die very early is extraordinary. If you survive into your 20s and 30s, chances are is that you will live on quite, as long as you do today, 70. But making it through those early years, especially if you are from the lower classes, is very hard.
But the progression of history is always a mystery, and obviously a person in the Middle Ages had no choice and had no idea about the kind of misery they lived in. I mean, for them it was a given fact of life, and I'm sure that if we projected ourselves into the future, possibly people 200 years from now can't imagine living in the year 2000, dealing with very old-fashioned methods of medicine that will have become outdated within a very short time.
As if life weren't hard enough, the conflicts that would become known as the 100 Years' War made it even harder.
By the 100 Years' War, which began around 1337, and which lasts more than 100 years, there are some very nasty things that are being introduced. One of them is the longbow. And at the Battle of Crécy and Poitiers, the French army, which is far superior and which is a feudal army of mounted soldiers, mounted knights, of noblemen, is laid low and destroyed by Welshmen archers with their long bows. They can put 10 arrows in the air in 1 minute, and these arrows pierce the armor of these French knights. And as they lay strewn on the fields of Crécy and Poitiers, these Welshmen will run around, their dead bodies seen, who is alive, who can be taken for ransom, and those who cannot be cured or cannot be healed, they lift their armpits, there is an opening underneath the armor, they have a long dagger, which is called the mercy givers, the misericordia, and they put it in to the heart. And here, nobility has come to an end. Oh, it will remain as a very powerful social force.
Western Europe, already devastated by famine and war, was racked in 1348 by bubonic plague, an epidemic of catastrophic proportions known as the Black Death.
Black Death is an event whose impact we can describe in cold historical fact. It's very hard to imagine what it would be like to lose a third of the population. And it's amazing that society didn't fall apart completely, which is what really you'd expect. And the fact that it didn't shows you its internal cohesiveness.
Yeah. Nonetheless, the plague spiritually and mentally had a tremendous impact. It It shook medieval civilization. It showed them that all the processions and all the prayers were for nothing, that governments were incompetent and inept in dealing with the great crises. So in some respects, yes, it improved conditions, and you could see the tremendous feeling of survival in a work such as Chaucer, Canterbury Tales. You could see the joy of being alive that is expressed by a work which is essentially a few years after the plague, 20 years after the plagues. And I would like to say that the plague returned every generation for the next 200 years. So it's not just 1348, 1350.
People's response to the Black Death was, there were several different responses that people had at the same time, both religious leaders and the common people themselves. On the one hand, certainly they regarded it as a punishment of sins. What those sins were wasn't always agreed upon. At other times, they assumed or they believed that it was the result of some conspiracy. In other words, that somebody or some group, like the Jews or lepers, notably, had caused this disaster.
I think that in many respects, the plague came to save some people. And I think part of the question was, isn't there more food available? Yes, there's more food, there's better lands available, there are more jobs. The conditions of those who survive improve considerably. What we forget sometimes is that while all this is going on, while the plague is ravaging Europe, while the war is going on, while rebellions are widespread throughout all of Western Europe, while famines are widespread as well, the Renaissance is in the making. Dante is finishing the last touches of the Divine Comedy in 1321, after this horrendous famine had killed probably 1/3 of the population of Northern Europe. That Boccaccio is describing the plague in Florence, that a great deal of important artistic work is going on in this period of crisis, that Europe did not collapse, that it was born out of that, essentially into a new world, which is the world of modernity.
Each time medieval Europe was devastated, either by natural catastrophe or by war, it bounded back with renewed vigor and determination. This might explain why the next period in the history of Western civilization, the Renaissance, was a breathtaking adventure in intellectual advancement. And though scholars of the Renaissance may have scorned the period that preceded them, they could not have existed without the groundwork laid by this extraordinary period of history, the Middle Ages.